have dialed has been changed.
Andy and Anthony podcast. Check it out.
The Andy and Anthony Experience.
Draft Cube by day, Andy and Anthony podcast by night. All day.
The rare Friday afternoon.
Friday afternoon.
All right, ready to go? Let's just do this thing.
Okay, go.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with Anthony. Recently decided to give up his urban life and move to his dilapidated inherited farm in the countryside Maddox.
I don't know what that's a reference to. I mean, yes, definitely. I've been playing Stardew Valley. Is that it? We got
You
there.
got there.
Yes. I did play Stardew Valley through for the second time a couple weeks ago.
And you're beating the game each time? Is there a beating state
I don't know if
to
there's a beating.
Stardew Valley?
There was a, I feel like I've done enough. There's not
Sure.
another new adventure coming to me.
Hillary's played a lot of Stardew Valley, but has definitely not reached whatever the end could be.
Yeah.
And previously just kind of gave up interest, but has also recently restarted the game. Something's in the air. I've picked up Minecraft again, which is...
How's that going for you?
It's dangerous. It's a little bit like saying I fell off the wagon, you know? Like, I don't want to minimize people with addiction, but I genuinely gave that game up because I was like, this is consuming my every waking thought, and I cannot have this in my life. And recently I felt like maybe I could have space in my life that wouldn't be all-consuming.
Maybe just one wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I'm giving myself a chance.
They had Minecraft playing on the TV over the bar at our local game store last week, and the bartender...
Minecraft playing? Just like someone playing on YouTube?
Someone doing, tutorials. Here's how you use redstone to build a cannon to shoot zombies and, stuff like that. And she's just like, everyone at the bar has been absolutely silent and so focused on this. This is great.
To be honest, I think that's kind of what... I think I got a B-double-O video recommended in my algorithm recently.
B-double-O?
It's the name of the guy. He's just this 40-year-old dude that's a Minecraft Let's Play YouTuber that I'm sure makes $1 gazillion on YouTube. He's, just a charming, charismatic guy that actually seems to have a background in fine arts. He talks a lot about fine art theories in his Minecraft builds. But some random video got recommended by the algorithm a month ago, and that's probably what actually planted the seed that made me eventually be like, I could probably just do this again.
We're all just victims of the algorithms.
I have a very curated relationship with my algorithms. I feel like I am constantly pruning them, always telling them less of this, more of this to try and get what I want out of them. I genuinely feel like I have a real relationship with them. Do you feel this way at all? I feel like you don't use the internet enough.
Absolutely not. No, I don't. I also think it's crazy the way that the word algorithm has completely changed its definition.
This is an actual algorithm, though.
I mean, there is an algorithm behind it, but people are just like, "Ooh, my algorithm." It's like, I don't know. We should talk about something else before I get too old man yells at clouds about words changing.
It's taking some massive pile of input from you and translating it into recommendations. And genuinely, the social media I use the most are the ones where I feel like I can understand my back and forth with that algorithm. Like Twitter/X, dead to me. It's completely useless. If it ever did, it doesn't work at all anymore. Meanwhile, YouTube, I feel like YouTube is very responsive. I'm like, no, actually, I don't want any more of this video. Because I watched a lot of slow motion and engineering stuff, and it was like, hey, you know what you would like? Gun YouTube. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
I would not like gun YouTube.
That's like when
and it listened to me.
I'm on the internet and I want to learn about kitchen knives, and it's like, you know what else you want?
EDC.
Lots of knives. And it's like, no, I want these really nice Japanese Sentokus or whatever.
You could curate your algorithm. I've been getting recommended videos by this ceramicist named Florian Gatsby that are these beautiful videos of this person making lovely ceramics and doing experiments. I feel like you're not a big social media guy, but
No, I don't. I try not to go
you
on
could find
the
some
internet.
stuff. Anyway, we don't have time to dilly-dally around, Anthony. First of all, we have an important announcement, which is that this is the last episode of Lucky Paper Radio because Joe Anderson said we were a Joe Rogan podcast.
Oh, that was the whole sentence. I thought I was going to interrupt you, and you were going to say a qualifying statement. But no, you said we're done.
Yeah, no, we're done.
Okay.
This is the last episode. Hope we had a good run. But yeah, according to Joe Anderson, every podcast is either an NPR podcast or a Joe Rogan podcast, and we're a Joe Rogan podcast. So I guess everybody go out and chug some ivermectin and isn't MMA cool, and whatever the person in front of me says is my new ideology.
I don't know how to deal with this.
I think in Joe's head, I'm the Joe Rogan, and you're the smart guest I have on that I then have my mind blown by everything you say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole appeal of the show, is some dumb meathead guy going, whoa, you're saying that black holes are
I was reading this morning
actually
about
full of light? What?
about ammonium bicarbonate, which is apparently a classic, a very traditional leavener for a lot of baked goods, and it's interesting in that it decomposes into a few different components which are all volatile, so it completely evaporates, unlike baking powder, which is commonly used today, which is sodium bicarbonate. Wait, no, that's baking. Anyway, I'm trying. Am I blowing your mind yet?
It's ammonium bicarbonate, so it's toxic in its raw form, but if you bake it,
it's not. I don't think you should eat it.
There's really nothing with ammonia in it.
Yeah, you don't want to eat ammonia.
But like, unlike baking powder, baking soda, presumably eating some will be not tasty, but also you'd be fine.
Right.
This one in its raw form would do massive harm to you, but when baked, it actually turns out even better.
I don't know. You can get it at Michael's. I might pick some up and experiment with some leavened steamed pastries.
Do me a favor and don't kill yourself by cooking with ingredients from Michael's. Small request.
Why?
I'm just saying, just don't do it.
Michael's sells all kinds of baking stuff.
Are you talking about the same Michael's?
The art store, yeah. You've been in a Michael's recently?
Look,
it's great.
I have a lot tied up and invested in you. Just don't. Just be sensitive to everyone else's needs when you take risks with your Michael's baking. I said we couldn't waste time, and then we did. This is not a Joe Rogan podcast. I mean, just because we have opinions, I guess we're a Joe Rogan podcast, and we don't talk like Ira Glass. Get right up on the microphone with vocal fry.
Act 1, onions.
Act 1,
Act 2,
randomness. Act 2, a game. We are, in fact, revisiting randomness from our episode last week, which got a lot of listener feedback as somewhat anticipated. I kind of thought we would do a follow-up to this anyway, just because after the episode I still had a lot more to say, but there's been enough feedback immediately that I think it's worth the rare, immediate 1-2 punch follow-up on Lucky Paper Radio. I have so many notes here, Anthony, but you and I haven't talked about the response to the episode. What is your overall feeling about randomness in the wake of all the things people have been sending to us?
I think that's something that I mentioned very slightly at the end of the episode, but was something that I was thinking about was sort of the idea that a lot of the randomness is kind of softened by the fact that you're drawing cards, but usually they're passing through your hand and you have an opportunity to strategize from them. It's not necessarily just like a random thing happens and that determines the output of the game. And it's just something that a couple people pointed out to as being described by a lot of other game designers as input versus output randomness. And I think that concept makes a lot of sense to me. I think it is definitely just very much a spectrum of the fact that some game systems have what they might call input randomness, where you start with some random thing and then you make decisions and operate based on the random stuff that's happening, versus output randomness, which is you do a thing and that determines the output of the game. It's like, we're going to roll this dice, and if whoever gets the highest number wins. That would be output randomness. And Magic is all along this spectrum where you're starting with the starting state of a bunch of random stuff, but then you make decisions based on it, but then more randomness keeps getting injected by the fact that you keep drawing new cards, new information, a new landscape of decisions to operate on. And it is funny how a game of Magic can sort of devolve and lose that sort of transitional space where you get to make decisions and operate on that randomness, specifically when you run out of cards in hand, and it's just like it's down to that point of, well, you're at 3, if I draw a lightning bolt I win, if I don't I lose.
I mean, even just top decking in general on a stalled board, like you feel completely out of control.
Yeah.
That feels exactly as random as just a cascade trigger. You're just like, well, hope the next one's good.
So I feel like that's all very interesting, and there's a lot we could, I'm sure, talk about there. The other thing I was just thinking about is how much, this all fits in this context of just, you're playing a game, the point is to create some interesting emotional and intellectual experience for your players, and the randomness is really, really fundamental to creating those fun, emotional experiences, and without it, you just wouldn't have a good game.
Yeah, I want to unpack input and output randomness a lot more because I do think that was the primary takeaway. Quite a few listeners sent links to videos or articles. This is a distinction that was new to me, and it sounds like new to you, basically, to describe different types of randomness. At least
the terminology was new to me, so I appreciate all the listeners sharing that.
Yeah, and to restate it, basically, input randomness is random thing happens, then you as a player get to make a decision. So in a lot of games, this is just like a randomized starting state. In Magic, it's your shuffled deck. Yeah,
so Settlers of Catan was one example that was mentioned, where you first randomize where the tiles are, and then players get to make choices on which areas of the board they think are going to be the most profitable.
Yeah, but if we're talking about just pure input randomness, when you make a decision, the outcome of that decision is completely known. Like, you know what's going to happen after you make your decision. There's no ambiguity there. All the randomness happens prior to that decision point. And output randomness is the exact opposite. Maybe you start with a completely known information, but when you do something, the output is unknown to you. Here, the example I think of is like D&D. You got your whole character sheet in front of you. You know everything you can do. but you don't actually know if it's going to work until you start rolling those dice. So you take actions and then things happen and you see what happens from there. Did you watch the Game Developer Conference talk about this as well?
I did, yeah.
I thought one of the most interesting distinctions here was another distinction I was unaware of, which was the distinction between strategy and tactics. Did you pick up on that?
That I might have missed. I might have been in the kitchen doing some other projects at the same time.
It's totally fine. We'll put a link in the show notes to this particular talk that was sent in by Yugman. Shoutouts to Yugman. The distinction made was basically that strategy, if you asked me prior to watching this video what's the difference between strategy and tactics, I would have thought they were just basically synonyms, right? Like they're just two different words that mean like planning for the future, right? But the distinction made here, which I have corroborated by just looking at a dictionary and looking at non-magic, non-game sources, is that strategy is very much about long-term planning. You make a goal, an abstract goal, and then you start making a plan to actually work towards that goal. But it's a long planning horizon. You are thinking about the far future. Tactics is making much smaller, much more concrete decisions in much shorter horizons of time.
So it's like climate versus weather.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good way of putting it. So, strategy game, like chess, you have to make a strategy for the entire course of the game, but evaluating an individual turn is tactics. And some games lean more heavily to prioritizing strategy versus prioritizing tactics. And I think, in general, Magic is mostly a strategy game, but there are clear examples of tactical decisions in Magic. Like how do you attack or block in this exact board state is like a tactics question. And that's related to what your broader strategy is, but you can have a really cogent and correct broad strategy and still make a tactical error in what do I do in this exact board state or how do I use this removal spell. And the first thing I immediately thought of was BattleBox. Like, BattleBox is a great example of a format where you can't have a strategy by this definition. Like, you don't get to say, here's my long-term game plan, because you literally have no idea where you're going to draw. You're going to draw from a stack of completely random cards in all 5 colors in most cases. But you can make lots of tactical decisions. Given this board state, given the cards in my hand, how do I maximize value? How do I gain advantage? So the difference between, an 8-person draft, which to me is probably like the epitome of strategy in Magic, where you get to draft one deck, play it across 3 matches, you know the whole pool of cards that are being drafted, or at least what you saw in the packs. You get to plan a big picture strategy for what your deck is and what it's doing. Compared to BattleBox, or, I guess you could say something like Dan, right? Where you just kind of are working with what you got, and you have to make a bunch of much smaller scale tactical decisions. That distinction was interesting, and one I had not thought of before that I think shone some new light on some things for me.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I get it totally intuitively yet, but I think that, when you put it in the context of what you're able to do there's just like a really meaningful distinction between the kinds of planning you can do in something like BattleBoxes versus a cube draft where you're drafting your deck and playing 3 rounds and you have this long-term strategy.
Maybe I can make it more intuitive for you. I think you and I are pretty good strategic players and pretty poor tactical players.
Oh, because I just take random game actions?
No, I mean, I have watched you, and I've talked with Zach Barish, who's also watched you play games where you were massively advantaged and just decided not to attack because you were scared.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I
think that there's a difference between being a non-tactical player and being a coward. I think we can slice that thin enough.
I think because of the way that we engage with the game, which is to say that we think about it a lot more than we play it, and we are designers at heart and thinking big picture, I think you and I are pretty good at saying, here's what my strategy should be in a given match, in a given cube, in a given game. I mean, this came up a lot in my coaching video I did with Brian Koval. I suffered from the same problem. I had a good strategy for the game and tactically just made the decision to turn the corner at the wrong time, right? And Brian was like, you should have turned this corner 3 turns earlier, and here's why. And I knew I eventually had to turn the corner. I knew the strategy, but I failed tactically to recognize that this was the moment to actually do that. I failed at the individual small-scale board state analysis. I think tactics are what you get better at with practice, and strategy is what you get better at with theory.
I see what you're saying. I mean, is this also something that is a spectrum, though? Because there are things of all different sizes.
Yeah, no, of course. This is definitely Magic is both, right? And there's no game I can think of that is just one or the other, right? There's just different...
Ogre battle tactics.
There's just different...
And Stratego.
There's just different lenses, different contexts in which you can highlight one kind of decision or over the other. And the whole reason this is relevant, though, is because these things relate, I think, very directly, as this talk points out, to randomness. Strategy games tend to have very little output randomness, because if you're making a big picture plan for what you're going to do across the entire course of the game, it's kind of not fun to have that plan ruined by a random output, right? And you can have as much input randomness as you want, right? You can start with an incredibly random starting state and then task your player with making a strategy from that random starting state. And as long as their actions are all deterministic, once I do this thing, I know what will happen. When I cast this card, I know what the result will be, assuming it doesn't get countered or whatever. You can make an incredibly strategic game that still has a ton of randomness. Meanwhile, the example given in the talk for tactics games were all like wargaming games, which all have the kind of like, I get to attack, I don't know how much damage I'm going to do until I roll my damage counter, right? So like a tactical war game is a series of much smaller decisions, right? Like you may have a broader strategy, but what's a lot more important is making the correct decisions on every turn and knowing that the random outcome of that turn is going to create a new game state for you next turn to make a new set of tactical decisions about. Like it's changing much more quickly in terms of like who's favored, who's not favored, and your strategy has to be adjustable because there's a lot more output randomness. You can't just plan to do this and know that if you succeed, you will win, because you might just roll poorly and then everything goes awry.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So, to come back to our discussion, a lot of people pointed this out and said, oh, Andy was just comparing different types of randomness, and what he likes is input randomness, and what he doesn't like is output randomness. And I think that's an okay simplification, though, to your point, Magic contains a lot of both, and specifically it contains a lot of this cycle where input randomness, which again, really all the input randomness of Magic is just your shuffled deck. And that means that every scry, draw a card, whatever, cascade is essentially because of the input randomness of Magic, right? If you got to stack your deck in the exact order you wanted at the beginning of every game, then cascading would not be random anymore, and Ponder would not be random.
So if you're playing blue, basically.
So it's not that those effects are fundamentally random, it's that they are relying on your deck, which is a fundamental random starting state, fundamental input randomness. But once you have drawn a card off of that input randomness, or once you have cascaded into something, that does create more future decisions for you. So it does have output randomness that then becomes the input randomness for new future decisions, right? I cast my Ponder. The input randomness of my deck yields me some choices, but then I get to make choices. I get to decide I'm going to put them in this order and draw. I get to shuffle, and now I have new random information that was the input randomness for the next decision I make. What do I cast after the Ponder? The output randomness of that Ponder is the input randomness for the rest of the game moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's this like ongoing cycle of new bits of randomness being injected, and then players often trying to like mitigate or navigate that random sort of sea of decisions.
And the bit about how a lot of output randomness kind of discourages players making a long-term strategy is a big part of what I'm viscerally responding to when we talk about a card like Jund Out. I think I even said, maybe not on the episode, but I said in talking about this on the Discord that like I am like kind of viscerally offended at the idea that I would create a cube where Jund Out would be good, because Jund Out has this menu of different options that are like just different stuff, and the idea that you could find success by just doing something at random instead of by choosing your modes and like choosing what you wanted to do was kind of offensive to me. And what it comes down to is that the same is true of a card like Bloodbraid Elf. I didn't say this in the episode and I almost added it in the edit, but one of the major differences between Ponder and Bloodbraid Elf is that they both have elements of randomness, as we've discussed ad nauseum. Bloodbraid Elf discourages you pretty strongly from putting conditional cards in your deck. You do not want to cascade into a thing that has no targets, or a thing that just doesn't work at instant speed with only your own spell on the stack, or whatever. You don't want to put combat tricks in, you don't want to put targeted removal spells in necessarily, and sometimes it's correct to do so and you whiff anyway, but in general it discourages you from playing a deck with a variety of cards and specific conditional answers, and encourages just playing a deck full of stuff that's just generally good. And that is not a thing I want to push my players to do in almost any of my cubes. I find that type of play to be so natural, actually. Like you can have a good stuffy deck in almost any cube, regardless of how much you have focused on curating it. But it's so easy to lose that benefit to playing conditional cards and reactive cards that I don't want to push my players that direction at all. Meanwhile, Ponder helps you manage that input randomness as much as possible and encourages you to put more conditional cards in your deck because you're more likely to be able to find them when you need them and not find them when you don't.
But what if you just play Ponder with Bloodbraid Elf? Now we've solved all the problems.
Yes, you can always do both. It is true. I
get what you're saying, but I also sort of disagree just in that I think that that's not the only thing Bloodbraid Elf does. Like, Cascade is also just, like, really exciting, and that randomness is fun, and figuring out not that, tactical decision, but the long-term strategy of how do I build a deck such that this whiffs the least often, or is, like, going to generate the most value for me. I think both those, like, strategic decisions and that emotional excitement of seeing what you're going to get, to me, are just, like, a huge part of what I enjoy about the game.
I think that is more subjective, though. I personally, even when I hit really well on my Bloodbraid Elf Cascade trigger, I'm not actually that happy about it. I just kind of feel bad if I do really well, because I'm like, oh, well, I guess...
So you're the problem. You're broken.
I mean, fun is subjective. We've mentioned this a million times. I think there's ranges to which different effects can be considered more objective or less objectively fun. Like we've said before, and I think it's true, drawing cards is one of the most universally fun things in Magic. I'm sure there are some players out there that don't enjoy drawing cards or enjoy drawing cards less than a lot of other things, but it's pretty close to a universally fun thing to draw new cards, get more information, have more choices available to you. I think,
right, but I mean, like, that's the same thing. It's like, draw a card, it could be anything, and the surprise of, is it exactly what I need or is it not, is almost the same thing as casting a Bloodbraid Elf, except you get that from the Cascade right away. The difference is whether you get to make choices based on that random result. With Cascade, you're casting that thing right away. I guess you can choose to decline to cast it, but it is like this manifestation of output randomness where the thing just happens and immediately impacts the game state versus drawing a card. Now it's just more information that you have control over and more space that you can make decisions about. So I think there is a difference there, but also there's a lot of similarity.
This is what I've been rolling over in my head for the past few days, because I feel in my bones there is a deep fundamental difference between the randomness on a Bloodbraid Elf and the card I've taken to comparing it to instead of Ponder, because there are more differences there. It's actually just Fact or Fiction. Also 4 mana. You also get 2 choices. In Bloodbraid Elf's case, you can choose to cast the card or not, and in Fact or Fiction's choice, you can take one pile or the other.
Okay, so we're sort of ignoring the other player part. It's just like you have a choice between 2 stacks of cards.
Well, that's another interesting thing which we can maybe get into. I'm not sure what there is to say there, but other players making decisions is kind of a sort of randomness. I mean, it's not strictly random, obviously, because it's
depending on your opponent.
It's another human. I mean, yeah, I guess Josh could be there rolling dice just to make people mad. It's not strictly random at all. Of course, it was another human making decisions, but it provides a unpredictable type of variety that has a very similar effect on the types of decisions you make that randomness would, right?
Yeah, I think it was mentioned maybe in the same video or something else that somebody had shared, but games are fundamentally, it is necessary for a game to be called a game that you don't know the outcome going in, and a big source of not knowing how the game is going to proceed is your opponent taking actions, which, maybe you even know what the best choice would be, but your opponent knows as well, so there is this, trying to play against each other that creates that unknown, even if it's not strictly random.
Right. But so to compare Fact or Fiction and Bloodbraid Elf, right, both are random in some sense, right? Bloodbraid Elf is going to cascade into a random card. We're assuming you haven't stacked the order of your deck at all for either of these examples. And also we're assuming you're playing a limited format where you haven't been able to draft a whole deck where you only have 2 cascade hits, right? You're going to hit one of 15 to 20 random spells in your deck that are 3 mana value or less. And in Fact or Fiction's case, you're going to hit the random top 5 cards of your library. To go back to last week's combinatorics, there's obviously way more permutations of the top 5 cards of your library, and then also permutations that your opponent could put them in different piles in for Fact or Fiction, which in some numerical sense makes Fact or Fiction a lot more random than Bloodbraid Elf, which is going to have, one of 15 to 20 possible outcomes, casting one of those 15 or 20 spells left in your deck when you cast it. But to me, there is a visceral difference between those cards. And so I want to unpack what those differences are. I kind of got into this in our last episode, which is that something about drawing cards being the randomness, that input randomness of your deck being in a random order, being the sole source of randomness of a card, to me feels like it is a more intrinsic part of the game than introducing additional randomness of getting to cast a spell for free. That's the next one on top of your library or something. And the other thing about these cards is that I think a lot of people's first response when they compare Fact or Fiction to Bloodbraid Elf is they say, well, Bloodbraid Elf can whiff. You can hit a 1-drop, you can hit a conditional spell that has no targets, but Fact or Fiction can never whiff. You're always going to draw, 1 to 4 cards, usually 2 or 3, and that's never a whiff. I would argue that it absolutely has the same range of whiff to not whiff, right? Bloodbraid Elf, you can hit nothing. You still get a 3/2. That's the baseline of Bloodbraid Elf. I mean, obviously, we're assuming the spells resolve in both cases. You could have either of these spells counter, but we're not talking about that. These spells are resolving.
But if they counter the Bloodbraid Elf, you still get the other thing, so...
Well, they should wait until the Cascade Trigger puts it on a stack and counter wherever the better one is anyway. It is better against counter magic than Fact or Fiction. Though Fact or Fiction is an instant. Look, we're assuming these spells are resolving. You're always getting a 3/2 with haste from the Bloodbraid Elf, and you're getting some amount of upside between 0, hitting a conditional spell you can't cast, something very low value like a random mana dork or something, and something incredibly high value, either a conditional spell that's great in that instance, that's a removal spell for their big threat, or you're hitting Fable the Mirror Breaker or Oko Thief of Crowns or whatever, and you're just going absolutely dummy. I think people feel in their bones like Fact or Fiction doesn't have as much of a whiff, but it definitely does to me, right? Like, drawing cards can absolutely whiff in the sense that, I mean, we can take the most extreme example. Let's just say you are dead on board and you have one answer in your deck and you cast Fact or Fiction and you don't see it, right? Doesn't matter what those 5 cards are. It doesn't matter how many you get. You're dead. You die. The game is over. That's obviously a pretty extreme example, but the same thing can be said for, I've had bad Fact or Fictions in my life. I'm talking to people on the Discord about it, and they're acting like they've never had bad Fact or Fictions, like they've never revealed 4 lands on a card they didn't care about. There absolutely is a whiff factor on that, and how much you care about drawing cards that are not that good at the moment, right? Let's just say you're late in the game, you have as many lands as you need, and you hit 5 lands. Now you're going to get 3 of them based on the piles your opponents make, which maybe you can find some value to discard them or something later. They're not useless, but how do they compare in usefulness to a 3/2 with haste? And I think there's a lot of situations where the result of your Fact or Fiction is worse than a 3/2 with haste. Do you reject that?
I don't
portrayal?
reject it. I mean, we could definitely... Yeah, sure. Sometimes Fact or Fiction will do nothing. Sometimes also 3/2 with haste does nothing. Like, I think it's difficult to compare the value and, like, literal, like, what is the gameplay value of these two different cards?
I mean, that's what we do. That's what Magic players do. It's card evaluation, right? Like, the worst case scenario of Fact or Fiction, I think, is as bad or worse as the worst case scenario of resolving a Bloodbraid
I agree
Elf.
that in both these cards can not be relevant on many board states.
And both can be incredible, right? Like, you can Bloodbraid Elf into your
the removal spell
thing,
and then jam in and have a great time.
and you can go end step Fact or Fiction and reveal 3 removal spells and Eternal Witness and Unburial Rights and just be like, what are you going to do? There's literally no way to put these cards in an order that is any good for you.
That sounds fun too. Let's get more of this happening.
So I guess leave a comment below if you disagree and think that the fail state of Fact or Fiction is not that bad. I think people keep coming back to this idea, this like heuristic that like, well, drawing cards is always good. And it is until it's not, right? Like, every game of Magic has a point where heuristics don't matter anymore, and what matters is your life total, right? Like, you can have as many cards in your hand as you want, and you're just dead because you didn't have the answers you needed at that moment. So, to say that drawing 2 cards is a better floor than making a 3/2 with haste, it's all conditional on the board state, like you said. You can never actually say that with certainty, but I would argue, based on all the Magic we've played and all of our card evaluation heuristics, that a reasonable fail case for Fact or Fiction is as bad or worse as a 3/2 with haste, and they both have really high ceilings. So here we arrive at 2 cards with the same mana value. They offer you as the player the same number of choices. They both care about the randomness of the top of your deck. They both, I would argue, have reasonably similar floors and ceilings in terms of their relative impact on the game. Do you, in your bones, feel like these cards feel different?
Yes, absolutely.
What feels different about them to you? Because I have never gotten mad at a Fact or Fiction, but I have always gotten mad. I'm more likely to get mad at a Bloodbraid Elf than I am to not get mad at it, because it feels like when a Bloodbraid Elf Cascade Trigger goes badly, it is the card's fault, and it never feels like Fact or Fiction's fault when it goes badly.
Oh, it's difficult to search for Fact or Fiction on Scryfall because it searched for all cards that have Fact or Fiction in the name.
It's quite a few now.
Okay. Now I've figured out my error
You
here.
don't know the rules text on Fact or Fiction by heart?
Look, it's reflex. I'm just typing in
good.
the
It's
cards
good.
that describe
It's fine.
Gotta look at all the different prints, figure out which one I'm picturing when I describe how I feel about Fact or Fiction. I mean, I feel like Fact or Fiction is a card that puts a bunch of more cards in your hand, and it just gives you a lot more options, which if you're a player that wants to be in control in terms of what you're doing is having more decisions that you can make and more options, then that's going to make you feel good. If you're the kind of player that just wants to, keep the gas pressed and keep attacking your opponent, you want to build your deck full of cards that all just say focus on the goal of getting your opponent dead as quickly as possible, and it doesn't really matter which one you draw because they're all doing that, then that's going to be much more exciting. I think these cards are very, very, very different.
Yeah, obviously they go in completely different strategies, and you as a player might prefer to play a controlling
so
deck
how are you
or
saying
an aggressive
they
deck.
feel the same?
I'm talking about with regards to their relationship to randomness. Like, let's say you're playing the right deck for each, and you have two outcomes, one casting where it goes really well for you, and one casting where it goes really poorly, right? Do you feel the same way about Fact or Fiction if you reveal 4 lands and hard evidence or something as a Bloodbraid Elf, flipping into a Llanowar Elves in your aggro deck?
Yeah, because if I'm playing the Fact or Fiction, I get a bad Fact or Fiction, I think, God, why did I choose to play blue? I should have played green-red, like I knew I would have more fun doing.
Is that a bit, or are you being serious?
It's a little bit of both.
Because to me, they feel very different. I'm trying to get to whether the relationship these cards have to randomness feels different to you, or whether it actually feels the same.
I think that the other aspect, like specifically of the relationship to randomness, I think maybe Fact or Fiction is a bad choice of card as an example, because you get 5 cards, you will always get your choice of any one of them, right? Unless your opponent gives you a 5 and 0. No, even then, you get to choose the 5.
You always get to choose.
The only
they can't
option
give you a
is
0
if
and
you,
a 0.
They can't give you 2 zeros. So if there is a particular card in the 5 you want, you always have your pick of it. And that fundamentally just doesn't feel that random. And I know that we did a lot of combinatorics last week to talk about how even, it gets increasingly more random the more cards you're looking at. That's true, but
to
also
a point. Once you're Fact or Fiction for your entire library.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, like looking at 4 cards is more random than looking at 3 because there are more possibilities, but if I'm casting Demonic Tutor, that's not random at all because I literally have the choice of my entire deck, and the closer you get to Demonic Tutor, the closer, like, the more cards you're looking at, the closer you get to Demonic Tutor. And then, if we sort of break it down a little bit on some heuristics and say, well, I have lots of different cards in my deck, maybe I'm playing Cube, so it's literally singleton, but if I categorize them as threats, answers, card advantage, a few different things, it's like, okay, digging 5 cards deep into my library, and I need one of these categories of cards, and I always have my choice of at least one of them, it starts to feel a lot less random.
Okay, so it does not feel random to you as the same way that Bloodbraid Elf feels random. I'm still just trying to get my whole head around your intuition about these cards.
Now, intuition is a very different
Okay,
card.
shut the... Because you mentioned that, you get to make decisions about Fact or Fiction. You also get to make decisions about the card that hits the battlefield after you cast Bloodbraid Elf, right? Like, assuming you hit a removal spell, you get to change how you attack or block. You hit a new creature, you get to choose how that creature attacks and blocks. It's not like Bloodbraid Elf does not also have future decisions based on the random input, right? The same way that the random input for Fact or Fiction leads to future decisions that can come up. And to be clear, I'm not making the case these are the same. I just can't... I feel they are different, and I can't fully articulate or logically suss out where they're actually different. Because when I start really picking it apart, it's like they're random in very similar ways.
But I think that's not true because, again, Bloodbraid Elf immediately impacts the board state, and you don't really get control over that.
Okay, but then Fact or Fiction immediately affects your hand, and you get.
But that's the thing is your hand isn't the game state really. Your hand is still.
You get to make decisions about things that are in play. You get to make future. You have future options based on what's in play, just like you have things that are in your hand.
I cast Bloodbraid Elf. There's nothing else in my hand. I did it all. I've hit my 4-drop.
I mean, honestly, what it comes down to, I think, the closest I can come to a meaningful distinction is that Bloodbraid Elf is likely to cause future decisions that are more tactical, because now the card is, like you said, in play. So now you get to choose, how do I attack and block with this thing? How do I use this exact removal spell? That is fundamentally a tactical question, I think. Whereas Fact or Fiction allows you and encourages you to strategize. You can have a big long-term plan for your deck. Either you're a control deck and you know Fact or Fiction's going to help you find that board wipe at the end of your turn so you can untap and wrath the board, or you're a combo deck and you know it's going to dig you really deep for your combo, or you're a graveyard synergy deck and you know that no matter what happens, you're sending some number of 5 cards to the graveyard, and that's just good for you in general because you have Delve Spells and Delirium and whatever. That fits into a, strategic long-term plan, whereas the randomness for Bloodbraid Elf, to me, does not actually fit into a strategic long-term plan. It encourages more future tactical decisions because you have another game piece now, presumably, unless you whiff on it completely. You have something else to do things with, either a spell on the stack for you to point at something, or a permanent in play that has an effect on the board and effect on how decisions are made. But I think it's the difference between strategy and tactics.
I'm not 100% sure I buy that. And also I'm just wondering, if you're saying strategy is more about longer term planning, is there just not strategy in decks that are trying to end the game very, very quickly because there's just not space for it?
I think that is your strategy. I mean, your long term is you don't. Those decks don't plan for what happens on turn 9 because they just assume they're dead by then, right? So your long term is only turn 4 because that's when you want things to effectively be decided. I think that is still very much strategic, and you could have built your deck in a strategic way with a long-term plan in mind to make the randomness from Bloodbraid Elf better on average, but the random cascade trigger off Bloodbraid Elf is not a strategic thing. It is at best a tactical thing. You can get something else to then use tactically, but fundamentally you can't make a strategic decision about the cascade. It just is a thing.
Well, you don't really make a decision at all.
You can choose whether to cast it or not, and you get choices about the thing in play. Again, like you hit a lightning bolt, what do you lightning bolt? But the fact that you couldn't have planned to hit that lightning bolt means that you have to make a tactical decision in that moment.
The decision is you have to make a decision right now.
That is tactics. You have to plan for what you're going to do in 4 turns. That is strategy. And the randomness specifically on Bloodbraid Elf discourages strategy and encourages tactical thinking.
And maybe it'd be easier to compare this to a card like Light Up the Stage or something else that gives you an impulsive draw. It lets you cast a card. It gives you an option to cast a card, but you have to cast it right now or you lose it. And that maybe feels more tactical about, like, is it worth giving up this card, or how do I get the most value about this in the moment because I don't have a long-term opportunity to use this card?
That's a really good example of how card advantage can not be good for control decks, right? Like impulsive draw tends to not be played in controlling decks because the whole point of those decks is they want to have a long-term plan. Meanwhile, you can play impulsive draw in a more proactive deck, and it effectively plays very similarly to actual card draw because you are making more tactical decisions because your long-term strategy is to play things to the board early and have fewer conditional and fewer context-specific spells and more things that just threaten your opponent.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, and again, it's like your strategy is in a very aggressive deck, often built around more interchangeable pieces, so being able to keep a few critical components that are going to be relevant late in the game is not so much as important as just deploy things as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
So my half-baked thesis here is that cards that interact with the input randomness of Magic, meaning like all the combinatorics randomness that comes from any kind of card draw, are fundamentally strategic, and they feed into that strategy in multiple ways in how you built your deck, what decisions you make in the moment, and how you actually play a game out. And those kind of strategic decisions are things that I really value. I don't dislike tactical decisions. I think they're very cool, but you don't need output randomness for tactical decisions. They just happen naturally over the course of playing a regular game. So what Bloodbraid Elf does effectively is say, I am a card that is going to discourage you from putting strategic cards in your deck, or I'm going to force you to have a strategy that is fairly proactive and unconditional and good stuffy, because I'm going to, when I'm cast, have a random output that cannot be used strategically and must be used tactically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is just a difficult, like, you're maybe entangling the ideas of randomness with other aspects of the game, and it kind of just depends on the tuning of the individual cards. Like, you could say something like Manifest is another mechanic that discourages you to some degree maybe from putting more conditional cards in your deck because
definitely not.
You want to be able to flip up a big creature.
So minor.
Exactly, but it's
so
like
minor.
the same thing, but then it's just tuned a little bit differently, so how much do you really care about it?
I don't see how that's... I mean, sure, but the cards we're talking about are ones where it really matters. Like, I think you genuinely, in most circumstances, shouldn't put counterspells in your Bloodbraid Elf deck. Or I was goldfishing a deck in another cube I've been working on, and I hit Edge of Autumn with my Bloodbraid Elf, and I was like, oh right,
Mm-hmm.
I literally can't cast... I mean, I can cast it, but it doesn't do anything, because it only gets land unless you have...
Sure hope you have Zurin Orb in play.
Right, well, yeah, because you can respond. Can you respond?
I mean... Edge of Autumn goes on the stack.
Right. It's going to resolve either way. Yeah. Anyway, there are cards that I think you're strongly discouraged from putting in your deck. I have never in my entire life made a deck decision because I have a Manifest card, and well, between these two cards, this one's better to manifest than the other one. Like, you've just
but I mean,
come up with an example that is so narrow and
that's
small
my point.
margin.
Is like, I think that you're talking about these individual cards and like the floor and ceiling based on the context of the deck you're putting them in. Like, does it impact your strategy? And I think that is much more about like the value of these cards and their impact on your deck, and not so much about some like fundamental truth about the nature of randomness.
I don't know. I think they're good examples of it, because I also don't like Jund them out. I also don't like other cards that have massive output randomness, even if you could say that Jund them out is costed so that on average it's going to be a really compelling, powerful card in the Bun Magic Cube, right? You could tell me that as a player, but the fact that that card, just like Bloodbraid Elf, discourages you from strategic thinking and encourages more tactical play is something I don't want to encourage my players to do. I just have new language to describe the types of randomness that I want to encourage and the types of randomness that I don't. There's more to get to, but the last thing on strategy versus tactics is I think this is a perfect place for the chess-poker dichotomy in Magic. Chess is all strategy, or the vast majority strategy, and poker is vast majority tactics. Like, you are given an individual hand, and you have to make a decision about that individual hand at that moment. Like, everyone's strategy, big picture in poker, is to go home with all the money. Like, there's not, I'm not aware of any like rope-a-dope tactic in poker where you intentionally give up a bunch of money early to get it back. Like,
oh, that's got to be a thing. That's called hustling, isn't it? That's like.
I mean, if we're talking about metagaming, but I don't know one's doing that at like competitive tables in the World Series of Poker.
Isn't that what Frank Lance talked about for like a whole chapter in The Beauty of Games, was how you have to alter your strategy and like convince your opponent in early hands of poker that you're, if not by giving up a lot of equity, at least like play in a certain way in order to create space for you to profit off of what your opponent thinks that your strategy is.
I don't know. I'm not a great.
You were too busy rolling your eyes at that chapter. You didn't.
I read
up
the
on
book,
this.
and the idea didn't get communicated to me. So whose fault is that?
Oof. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Look, maybe there is a ton of deep, long-term strategy in poker. My impression is that it is a ton of tactics. It is a ton of, you are in this exact state right now. That's the flop. This is your hand. That's the bet. What do you do in this moment? And your broad strategy is, of course, to take all the money. Like, that's what you want to do no matter what.
I don't know that much about poker, so I'm just gonna go on Frank's knowledge here that he gave me through that book. That I don't think that's true.
Another thing to sound off in the comments about. You don't think it's at least much more tactical? Like, you can foresee very reasonably what the next 5 possible board states are for a game of chess. Like, that's what good chess players do. You literally have no idea what your next hand is going to be. You cannot plan for it. It is tactics. You are making decisions in every single individual moment. You can't say, I'm going to plan to win the early hands and then not win the late hands. You have no control over that. You have to make small tactical decisions to, over the long run, be slightly better on average than your opponents.
That is true. I mean, maybe again, it's like I don't quite know where the boundary is or what the key like benchmarks for what is a strategy decision and what is a tactics decision.
We talked about it. Long-term, short-term.
Yeah, but what is long and what is short?
How long is the game?
Well, if it's, I don't know. I don't play that much poker.
Okay, in poker, it's till you run out of money, or all of your opponents run out of money.
Very short game for me.
In chess, it's until one of the kings is captured, right? Like, that's your timeline to work on. You can make a plan for chess that spans the entire game. I would argue that good chess players fundamentally have to make a strategy that spans the entire game. In poker, you literally can't plan for your next hand. You just can't do it. Not until those cards are in front of you and the flop's on the table and you see how your opposing players bet can you make any decision about how you're going to bet. Like, predict how you're going to bet in the next hand. You literally can't.
Let's take something else that was mentioned in that same video that you mentioned, where enough randomness starts to become not random again.
I was going to talk about this too.
I'm going to roll 1 dice. That's a very random event. If I'm going to say, we're going to roll 1,000 dice, it kind of starts to get washed out in the average when it's like...
I wrote down like the exact same note, basically.
And I kind of feel like this, you're trying to minimize poker by saying you can't plan ahead.
I'm not minimizing at all.
If you're playing hand after hand after hand of poker, it's like, yeah, there's lots of tiny decisions, but I feel like in the same way as rolling a bunch of dice, your strategy has to come through in the structure of how you approach each of those tiny random encounters.
Oh, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not minimizing it at all. I think poker is incredibly skill testing, very difficult. Like, I'm incredibly impressed with people that are good at poker. I just think the type of decisions are fundamentally different when you have no idea what future information is going to be. It is literally unknowable to you. You can know the range, you know all the possible 2-card hands you could have, and you maybe know their likelihood, but you literally have no idea what your next hand is going to be. It's not like your opponent is going to manifest a new piece out of nowhere in a game of chess that you couldn't have predicted.
That would be cool.
That fundamental difference in how long you can plan for the future is the difference between strategy and tactics, and that to me is the difference that I want to have language to describe in my cube design decisions, because I think Bloodbraid Elf is a very interesting tactical card, and I don't mean to minimize tactics, as I think some players are really good at tactics. There's probably people listening that prefer tactics and are like, I mean, you've described in the past you really like when there's no aggro and no control player when the game starts. It's just that both players have mid-rangey cards in their deck, and every turn you have to decide if you're the aggressor or not. That's a much more tactical style of Magic than sitting down and saying, I have 4 board wipes in my deck and 2 planeswalkers that can win the game, and I have a plan, and I have to work towards that strategy. Being able to describe the difference in the types of decisions you make in a deck where you have a plan and you're working towards a particular outcome, and a deck where you are being tactical and have to change the context of your decisions rapidly because there's always new information that dramatically shifts the advantage bar basically in the game. That distinction is very meaningful. Mm-hmm. And in the latter, I think Bloodbraid Elf is a cool card. And if you are excited by the randomness like you are, then you should put it in the cube and be totally okay with it. But I think it's also a cogent argument for why, if you want to encourage the former, Bloodbraid Elf is not a good fit. What are you smirking about?
Somebody just posted a picture of a dog wearing glasses, and it's great.
Is it sitting at the beakers in front of a science desk?
No. This is an authentic, one of a kind, direct from Dom Harvey. It's very good.
Beanie.
I'm just curious about you're describing your own personal.
People can
taste and
timestamp this
preferences.
exact recording now if they find that picture of Beanie in the
That's
Cube Talk
true,
Discord.
Yeah. I had the content discussion channel open for a reason. I'm sorry I got distracted by Beanie, apparently. So your own personal preference is to lean towards these longer-term strategic planning. You also have a cube that is very intentionally designed to keep games very short and have lots of
long is
proactive
relative,
games.
bro.
Okay.
Long is all relative.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the length of the game is long. If the game is 3 turns, if you have a plan across those 3 turns, that is a long-term strategy. I hope this makes sense to people. Obviously, if not, we're going to hear a lot about it. The die roll thing I thought was so beautiful in that video because it so succinctly describes, you have no way to predict the outcome of a single die roll. It's going to be equally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, and there's no way, aside from that die being somewhat fixed, that you can ever, with any certainty, predict the outcome of it. You can pretty confidently predict the range of outcome of 100 die rolls, right? If I ask you to guess the average of 1 die roll versus the average of 100 die rolls, you're going to be way better at guessing the average of 100 than the average of 1 because multiple random things happening over and over again makes the overall experience less random. Which I think is...
this again, I'm stuck on this climate versus weather because that also makes perfect sense. It's like weather day to day, it's kind of going to be all over the place. Wind is crazy and complicated, but enough of it happening year to year, it does start to become like more cyclic and understandable in this aggregate pattern.
Right. You can imagine hundreds of years ago, somebody being like, how could you possibly know it's going to be cold in 3 months? It's like, well, because we actually do know big picture things about the like overall trends that even though I can't predict the temperature tomorrow, I can do a pretty good job predicting the temperature in 3 months or whatever, right?
Right.
That to me is like the most concise and beautiful explanation of just Xerox theory. It's like, why is drawing a card good? It's random. I might get a land, I might get a spell. Like, why is that a good thing to do? It's like, well, in the individual instance, it's maybe not that good, right? Like just putting blue mana, draw a card in your deck is not that great. But when you are drawing 5, 6, 7 additional cards over the course of every game, it is going to dramatically increase the consistency of your deck. That random thing over and over again is going to trend towards the average. You are going to trend towards being mana screwed less, finding your answers more, finding what you need when you need it, as opposed to every game being much more high variance. It also, I think, it does a really good job describing, we even mentioned on our last episode, Maelstrom Wanderer, the card that says Cascade on a 7/5 for 7 mana. Did I get it right? I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think I've ever had the joy of casting it, to be honest.
I have played against it in Commander back in the day, way back in the day when I played a lot of Commander, and it was always one of the biggest groaners, and the reason it was such a big groaner is because that stupid deck did the same thing every single time. Playing against that deck was just an extremely repetitive experience. And
are you thinking of Maelstrom Wanderer? You're thinking of Idris, the thing that gives like every card you've...
I'm thinking of Maelstrom Wanderer, the 7
cool.
mana one, not the 4 mana one that came out later.
Okay, I got hurt by another Commander deck. But it was the same thing. It was like, you're going to cascade, and technically you're doing different things, but it feels the same every time. It's just like...
Well, it actually is,
crap
too.
Out
like,
a bunch of
it's
stuff.
a fundamentally random output mechanic in that you don't know what you're going to hit off either of those cascade triggers. But when you design your deck to cascade 30 times in the first 6 turns of the game, play 100 games where you cascade 30 times, and the outcome is going to be pretty darn similar every single time because you're going to trend towards this average. Which I think, to bring this back to cube design, is an argument for having a consistent approach to how you handle random output. I think that is a good argument for saying that Bloodbraid Elf in the same cube as Jundam Out and Shardless Agent and whatever your favorite random output cards are, Augur of Bolus or Collected Company, those cards all kind of belong together. And if you just put one in an environment without any of the others, then that one is, I think, more likely to be a feel bad than when you are just always kind of rolling that dice a little bit. Which again reminds me of D&D. Like, obviously, like a critical miss feels bad in D&D, but you are so accustomed to knowing that every single thing is a roll that you have no expectation. Your expectation going in is it's going to be random. If every other card in your cube has a predictable output except for Bloodbraid Elf, then it's like, well, now it just doesn't really fit anymore, and it feels out of place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always going back to, a lot of it just comes back to expectations and how that shapes the way people feel about things. So what you're saying is we need to put just like a whole bunch more cards with Cascade into most cubes.
I think people that enjoy those play patterns should genuinely consider it. I think it would mean that if people could draft a Cascade deck, which would diminish the impact of an individual random Cascade flip and instead contribute to a broader strategy. Like, the more you support that, the more you can strategize around it and say that I actually am going to have a long-term plan that is to Cascade 3 to 4 times in every game, and that's going to mean X amount of value based on how I built my deck. Like, part of what I really don't like about Bloodbraid Elf in a lot of environments is that there's nothing else that rewards that type of deck building. So it's like, all right, just put a bunch of random good stuff in your deck, so if you play Bloodbraid Elf, it's correct. Like, it's one of those cards that I feel like you are quite often going to get punished for making the correct decision, right? Like, you're supposed to put Abrupt Decay in your Bloodbraid Elf deck. It's a really good card, and the chances that you hit it off of your Cascade are so small compared to just games where you draw Abrupt Decay and it's really strong. But sometimes you're going to Cascade into Abrupt Decay and your opponent's going to have 2/4 drops and you're going to feel really bad about it. I'm lost in the sauce over here, but I think that the dice rolling
Don't worry, I got this. I'm going to build the Cascade Cube, and not the one you're thinking of, and it's going to be great.
The Cascade Cube is a perfect example.
Very few cards with Cascade.
Yeah, but it's a
Anthony, dangerous mechanic.
Anthony, it's not a good mechanic. It's a bad mechanic.
I don't know why I'm here defending Cascade, but that's what's happening today.
I mean, the Cascade Cube is a really good example. Like, that is a whole cube where fundamentally every single player takes a random action every time they cast a spell with random output, but because you're doing it every single time, the decks are remarkably consistent. It's also...
To be fair, yeah, last time I played it, all of my 1-drops also cast Demonic Tutor, so I don't know if it was exactly...
There's a little bit of that, too. Like, you can also have your cheap stuff do very consistent things by limiting those number of spells, but ultimately, I think the decks play out in that cube way more consistently than in regular cubes, even though there are a ton of random output effects.
For sure.
Anyway, the die roll thing I'm going to come back to all the time to describe Xerox Theory, because it just seems so beautiful and eloquent. Crimson Yoshi posted a poll in the Cube Talk Discord content discussion channel to ask which card people found more offensive to their design sensibilities, Neverwinter Hydra or Carnage Tyrant. Carnage Tyrant, I think, is the more commonly known card. It's 4 green for a 7/6 with trample and hexproof. And it also can't be countered. So it's just
That's important.
It's just a fantastic anti-control card and demands that your opponent either have a bigger board than you, have you basically dead already, or have a board wipe, because there's very few other ways to answer it. Neverwinter Hydra is XX green for a creature Hydra. It's a 0/0. And when it enters the battlefield, you roll XD6, and it comes in with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the total of those results. And it has trample and ward 4. I think this is a really fascinating comparison. And for the point of this comparison, let's just assume that ward 4 and hexproof are almost identical, right? Like, I can see people arguing in the comments about, like, I can Swords to Plowshares the Hydra, but I can't the Carnage Tyrant. Sure, you're right. You're very smart for thinking of that. We're all very proud of you. For the purposes of this comparison, let's just treat ward 4 and hexproof as effectively the same thing. You're not going to be able to remove this with a targeted removal spell at most points of the game. When cast for the same mana cost, for 4 green, Neverwinter Hydra, on average, is going to be a 7/7 with trample and ward 4 to Carnage Tyrant's 7/6 trample hexproof. Very similar. There's also the can't be countered stuff. These aren't one-for-one comparisons, but very similar. Obviously, Neverwinter Hydra has other upside, right? Like, yes, Carnage Tyrant can't be countered, but you can cast Neverwinter Hydra on just 4 mana. You can also cast it on 8 mana or 10 mana. You can, it's much more flexible than Carnage Tyrant is. And obviously, the results of those rolls have a much wider range, right? Like, you have a 1 in, 36 chance of it being a 2/2, of it just rolling Snake Eyes when you cast it on 6 mana, and it being a 2/2 with trample and ward 4. Similarly, you have a 1 in 36 chance of it being a 12/12 with trample and ward 4. Neverwinter Hydra is so much more offensive to me, which is probably not surprising to anyone listening. I mean, obviously, the lines can't be countered and hexproof are, as listeners know, among some of my least favorite words to have on a Magic card. I vastly prefer ward to hexproof. But Carnage Tyrant is a card that, to me, beautifully speaks to a long-term strategy. I had it in my Bum Magic Cube for a long time, despite my distaste for those keywords, because there was a long time where I felt the green ramp decks were heavily disfavored against control decks. Just really struggled against decks that had a lot of counter spells, a lot of removal spells, and board wipes. And in that circumstance, that card was a precision tool. This is a card you play when you otherwise can't beat targeted removal and counter spells. When you're looking at it in the draft, you can see that immediately. You can decide if you are weak to the kinds of decks that that card is strong against, and you can make it part of your long-term strategy, which you can also do with Neverwinter Hydra, but some percentage of the time you do that with Neverwinter Hydra, it's going to shoot you in the foot. You're going to have made that long-term plan. You're going to have navigated the gazillions of games that could possibly happen in Magic, and you will have correctly predicted that at some point in this draft, I might have 6 mana up against my opponent who's got a bunch of open blue mana and removal spells in their hand, and I might have drawn this card. You will have navigated all of that beautiful input randomness, and sometimes you're going to play Neverwinter Hydra, and it's just going to be a 2/2. You will not be rewarded for your long-term strategy. I think it's a really tidy little case study in how that kind of output randomness really discourages long-term strategy, right? Like, on average, you should treat Neverwinter Hydra just the same, right? Like, if you're playing tactically, like, it's on average going to be the same. Put me in that situation 100 times, and Neverwinter Hydra is going to be, on average, basically the same.
I think it's slightly better, right? Because the average die roll in a D6 is 3.5.
Yeah, it's a 7/7 compared to a 7/6. I mean,
sure,
1
sure.
point of toughness.
Perfect. Great.
That's what I said.
Mm-hmm. Keeping you honest.
But it's so offensive to me that if you make this part of your long-term strategy, and all of the other variance and randomness in the game plays out, you get to that situation in that you get paired against the player, you arrive at that particular game state, that of which there are millions in, gazillions of possible game states. You've arrived at one of those game states where this matters. Your long-term strategy could get paid off, and then in that moment you might just be failed by a die roll. That is why these cards are so upsetting to me, and I so much more prefer cards that allow you to manage that input randomness and are still random, right? Like, I still am in love with the fact that every ponder, every factor fiction is completely unique. It is a new puzzle to solve. There are heuristics, the same way there's always heuristics, but that is its own little, self-contained tactical decision, but it's a tactical decision with direct impact on your strategy for the rest of the game, direct impact on your long-term plan. The random stuff happens, and you get to make a tactical decision about it a lot of the times, or it leads to future tactical decisions, but it's fundamentally so hard to make that part of a long-term strategy because you can't rely on your game pieces to do what they say they do, or do what you expect them to do or want them to do in a given circumstance.
But it gets more and more consistent the more you spend on the Neverwinter Hydra, because eventually it's just going to be half of what you spend, right?
Yes, on average, Anthony,
So great.
You're right. But that's where it comes down to the point of Cube, right? Like, how many times am I going to draft and cast Neverwinter Hydra in the control matchup? Ever, if I have it in my cube. Like, maybe a handful, if I'm lucky. So I'm not going to get to feel that average in the aggregate. If I was building, constructed decks to play against each other in, rapid matches or something, I could see the argument for this, because it's like, all right, well, you're going to do this a bunch. You got 4 copies of Neverwinter Hydra. Your opponent's got tons of removal spells that they can't afford to pay the word cost for, so, this is going to happen a bunch, and you're going to get to experience that multiple die rolls, that, average that just makes this card playable. When you put it in a cube that already has so much randomness, already has so much variance leading you to the point where that card could even be castable and even do its job, then to get punished by it, it's just unconscionable to me.
I think is a pretty fair point, that when we're talking specifically about Cube, and especially in the context that more of us are finding ourselves in, where we're playing a lot of different cubes, that this kind of randomness doesn't feel as necessary, whereas maybe you're building a commander deck and it's all about dice rolls, and you want to really focus on that aspect of the experience of feeling the aggregate experience being what you expect, average, and having lots of repetition with it, but then also having the opportunity for those really high highs of, I rolled 2 6s on this when I cast it for 2 dice, and yeah, it's not necessarily necessary.
Just because I know people are going to ask the question in the comments, I ended up fixing that problem with green being so bad against blue by just dramatically lowering the curve in green. Your threats are now 2 mana instead of 5 mana, and guess what? All your counter spells and removal spells are nowhere near as good. And I was able to strike a balance that way that does not rely at all on uncounterable spells or anything with any kind of protection.
This Hydra is also making me think how this is just exactly Mana Gorger Hydra in the Turbo Cube, because either you win the dice roll and you get to play it first, and then it's a 14-14, or you lose the die roll and it's a 1-1.
I think it's okay to play Mana Gorger Hydra later.
It's fine, but it's not... It feels like you lost the dice roll.
One of the cards I just love, like the delta between how much I love that card design and how much it fits in any of my cubes is a sad little delta for Mana Gorger Hydra. All right, I got one more point I want to bring up.
Okay.
I think it's a pretty quick one. Parker mentioned that he was interested in hearing more discussion about how randomness in Magic allows you to basically launder bad feelings about skill disparity. And
you don't think that you don't want to give Parker that much satisfaction. You want to.
I don't know what there is to say about it. I agree. Like the fact that there is variance in Magic, and that you or I could sit down and theoretically beat Paul Vito Dominarosa, or that you or I could sit down and lose to some new player and then just be like, well, it was just bad luck. Like both those things make the game challenging and deep, and definitely have a big impact on the emotional experience of playing Magic. Like again, coming back to my kind of original point that I was trying to get through in our first episode, I love that this game is so deep and random. Like it is one of the most beautiful things about the game to me.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know that I have a lot to add on to that. I think
it's definitely worth saying.
Like a huge part of what makes the game. It's what makes the game fun to come back to again and again.
Yeah, and I think if you're really spiky, you should be careful about how much you ascribe your wins to your incredible skill and ascribe your losses to your opponent's good luck. You should be pretty circumspect about that. But I think if you're just playing casually, you can tell yourself that story all you want. If it makes you happier at Cube Night, Cube Night's about having fun. So
yeah, I think that's something that helps me a lot, is really trying to pay attention to when you're drawing really well and when you keep a bad hand and you probably should have mulliganed and then you just draw exactly what you need, because it's so much easier to see when the randomness is working against you. So appreciating those moments of like, yeah, I kind of got away with something keeping this hand, that actually trying to feel the full impact of that spread of randomness is valuable.
Yeah, I was looking over Zach Barish's shoulder as he won the finals of Cube for a Cause and saw him in one game just draw incredibly in a way that like surely must have been demoralizing for his opponent, who I know is a listener. Shout out to you listening out there. You played great, and Zach got very lucky. The game where you played Ragavan on turn 1, Zach had the Path to Exile, but no white mana, and then just top-decked, untapped white, and got rid of the Ragavan immediately, and otherwise was going to be in dire straits pretty quickly, and then also continued to draw exactly what he needed at every point in the game. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just like, to some degree, goldfishing a deck is just a little fun. It's not playing a Magic game, obviously, but it is a little fun to just goldfish a deck, to draw 7 cards, play out a couple of like turns of like, here's how I would curve things out. I have a couple removal spells, assuming I have to remove a couple things. That feeling of like just riding that input randomness, just navigating it, the fact that just shuffling up your deck and drawing 7 cards off the top and seeing how this massive sea of probability and randomness interacts with your perceived strategy and your drafted deck is fundamentally kind of fun, is a huge part of why Magic is great.
Absolutely.
All right. So I think we solved it all, right? We clarified input-output randomness. We have new language to describe strategic versus tactical decisions in games of Magic and certain types of cards that encourage or discourage either. We've settled the Fact or Fiction, Bloodbraid Elf.
Exactly the same.
Differences. They're exactly the same, except for the ways in which they're different. We all agree that Carnage Tyrant is no fun, but Neverwinter Hydra is even worse. And the randomness is really helpful because it allows us to pretend that we're actually good players even when we lose.
Thanks for putting that all together, Joe Rogan.
I mean, I get what he's saying, but I listened to an episode of, what was it called? It's called Search Engine or something that Joe posted in the channel, and I never listened to like the NPR style podcast anymore, and I don't know why. Like, it is absolutely no fault of Joe's or anybody's, and no like criticism to PJ Vogt and this podcast, but I found it almost unlistenable. Like the amount of like Ira Glass voice and like little synthy like boopy music that's put in at moments to try and like increase the drama or tension, and then like PJ acting like this revelation from his guest was like incredibly novel and profound, when it's like, either you knew that already, PJ, or you're kind of dumb. Like,
yeah, he's hamming it up. It's a performance.
I can't do the performance. I just can't. Give me a podcast where half the episodes are bad, but they're never faking it all day, every day, because I cannot handle the performance. My sensors for it are so attuned, and for some reason my sensibilities are like, I just can't handle it. I can't do it. I don't know when that happened to me, but I just can't anymore. Because I got into podcast 20 years ago, 15 years ago, listening to, I guess it was 18 years ago now, I listened to my first podcast, and it was This American Life. And that's how I got into podcasts. I was like, what? I can listen to this cool NPR show whenever I want. I listened to a bunch of those, and then very quickly found my way to indie podcasts and never looked back. But I get it. I get the Joe Rogan comparison, but I hope that you think we have more of a brain in our head than Mr. Rogan does.
Not me. I'm just over here casting Bloodbraid Elf and
Bloodbraid Elf, the Joe Rogan of
and
magic
one of
cards. How many of our listeners do you think are huge fans of Joe Rogan that we're going to hear from?
Statistically, after this episode,
statistically, a pretty
probably
decent
none.
chunk. I mean, some.
I think I've listened to one episode of Joe Rogan's podcast.
Here's what I'll say about Joe Rogan. I detest the man. I think he's kind of awful and a monster in a lot of ways.
I remember when I first heard about, like, the guy who had The Man Show is now starting a podcast and he's cool now. Like, that's a weird turn.
I don't know where you got the he's cool now.
Yeah, it turns out, no, he's not cool now. He actually
his
sucks
like,
a lot.
sexism and chauvinism and anti-trans politics are all, like, detestable. He's a horrible person. I think he is kind of a brilliant interviewer because he genuinely talks to people.
Oh, so he has that, like, revelatory, like, PJ vote moment, but he's not
you
actually believe he is that dumb.
First of all, he is genuinely curious. Let's give him that. And he is genuinely open-minded, oftentimes to a fault. But he's genuinely open-minded, and I think he does a really good job of being his listener, who is largely
be careful.
I mean, he has a very broad appeal. So on average, his listener is just like a normal bro. Let's be honest, they're all dudes, mostly dudes. Is a normal guy.
That's probably true.
That like maybe is kind of curious about stuff and wants to have his little bean blown every once in a while, but is not going to go read the Wikipedia page about it to learn about it, right? And I think he actually does a pretty good job. He does a pretty good job at asking the dumb questions that I think a like NPR interviewer would be embarrassed to ask, and that's genuinely good. Like, we should be asking the dumb, obvious questions to people, because trying to show that you've done your research going into an interview often just makes it less accessible for people. And that's why a lot of people find NPR interviews to be absolutely insufferable and elitist, because they do fundamentally seem that way. Meanwhile, Rogan's talking to Edward Snowden. He's like, so what's a computer? You know, like...
That is the one episode I listened to, and that's basically, he's like, so what's a computer? And then Snowden is just like, I'm going to read my prepared piece, and you won't
I
say
thought
anything.
Snowden did a pretty good job.
I think he did a great job. I think because he just didn't need Joe Rogan to say anything.
I've listened to a couple of Joe Rogan podcast episodes before. The one with Snowden. I listened to his one with Bernie back in the 2016 campaign. I've listened to some episodes.
Listened to that one too.
And I'm not unfamiliar with the man's vibe. He's just got an open mind, sometimes to a fault. And anyway, that's it for this episode of the Andy and Anthony experience. Is that what we're going to call the fact that the show is called the Joe Rogan Experience is just impossibly cringe. If we got any of the rules text wrong for any of the cards in this episode, that was intentional to bait you into engagement. So if you leave that comment, we win. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about randomness and speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Can I ask, how often do you and Zach Barish get together and talk about how bad of a player I am?
Okay, it came up just once.
Okay.
at Cube for Charity, when I was talking about my flaws as a player, and he went, oh, I watched Anthony lose a game that he literally couldn't lose unless he just did this one dumb thing, and he just did it repeatedly. And I was like, oh, well.
What was it?
I think it was just not attack when you were massively advantaged and give your opponent 4 turns to draw an out when you could have had him dead in 2 or something.
Yeah.
You can ask him. I'm sure he remembers the game state exactly and be very happy to walk you through it.
Yeah.
To be clear, I think I suffer from the exact same thing.
I did very badly at that event, so...
You got a pin from every event you've been to, though.
I did. Yeah.
I don't have one from Steel City Cube, and I am very depressed about it.
Next year?
I can't be that depressed about not having one from CubeCon, because I think I played in like 1 or 2 drafts because I was doing so much commentary last year. But I did play in 1 draft. I felt like I won a draft, but I actually just beat Sam Black in round 2 and then lost in the finals, but it felt like I won that draft, you know? I should get a pin for beating Sam Black.
Absolutely.
A pin that's just Sam Black's head on a spike.
Oh.
Uh-oh. Now that's Joe Rogan for you.